Coming in at number 5, need more children. If anyone ever says this phrase to you, feel free to run away at speeds previously unknown to man, or knock them out. You have my full support. However, if the individual in question ends up being a Wendigo, then you're probably not going to have much luck with either of those tasks. They're just too strong and too spooky. And they get what they want most of the time, as evidenced by this story told by a now deleted Reddit user. I wonder how they're doing these days. I'll do my best to abridge this story for the sake of the length of today's video, so here we go. A man, his girlfriend, and their 3-year-old son all went out of town on a camping trip. At the behest of his superstitious partner, our storyteller packed the classic camping supplies, plus a shotgun, rifle, combat knife, and machete. When they reached their campsite, they noticed that the park rangers were kind of on edge and didn't seem to notice that they brought a whole pile of weapons. Odd. Onwards they trudged though and set up camp. That night they witnessed a horrible scene. It looked like someone had brutally killed a large animal, a buck perhaps, and dragged it away by the antlers. Not an easy task by any metric. Unnerved but resolute, they ate dinner and fed their son, then went to bed. In the middle of the night, a strange noise echoed throughout the woods, waking the man. He sat up and heard what sounded like muffled crying, prompting him to peek outside of the tent. What he saw he couldn't quite explain. It was like an enormous deer, slightly misshapen with enormous antlers and a strangely human presence about it. The man didn't need to see anything else. He pulled out his gun and shot it multiple times, causing it to bleed and shriek. It didn't die though, and before it disappeared into the night, it said the words, "Need more children." The man and his panicked wife then passed out. The panic didn't disappear the next morning either, as their son was not in the tent with them. They called the police, who arrived to investigate the blood left by the creature, and the man seemed to overhear them say something about it getting more bold. Unfortunately, their son was never found. Coming in at number 4, the Texas Wendigo. Traditionally, Wendigo are only found along the East Coast forests, around the Great Plains of the United States, and in the areas surrounding the Great Lakes. It's not often that you'll hear stories of them coming from other places, but parts of Texas are indeed located upon the Great Plains. And this Wendigo in particular made quite the name for itself in the area. From 2016 onwards, folks from the Yorktown, Texas area reported seeing a hulking figure almost 10 feet tall lurking around forested areas. It became such a common sight that a lot of people decided to avoid the woods altogether for a while. One intrepid explorer wanted to get a closer look at the thing, so he started frequenting the spots that it was most often sighted. During his search, he heard many noises characteristic of a Wendigo, the sounds of wounded or dying animals, human-like shrieks, and even basic sentences, all meant to entice him into the woods. Whoever this guy was knew the Wendigo's tricks though, and stayed well away from anywhere he'd be vulnerable. One evening, with plenty of mist still hanging in the air, he ran into the real deal. In an opening, he saw an old metal structure and 2 white houses, and between them a tall, lanky figure. It seemed to be spying on the inhabitants of these homes with devious intentions. He tried to ignore it as best he could as it walked along the path. Suddenly, a wave of overwhelming dread hit him and he got to running. Looking back behind him, he noticed that the Wendigo was now on all 4s, but still stood at around 5 feet tall. Thankfully, it didn't give chase, as the man theorizes that this was because the Wendigo was more interested in the housebound prey. To this day, he still thinks about its bone-white skin, bald head, dark black eyes, and humanoid face. He hasn't revisited the area. Coming in at number 3, we've got the frogs. Sometimes a story will draw you down one path and then pull out a twist so devious your spine will stay tingled for weeks. This is just such a tale. What do frogs have to do with the Wendigo? Well, just sit back and listen and I'll tell you a tale. This comes from Reddit user Unathana, who has a long history of listening to frogs make noise at night. When they were a kid, their grandmother would reassure them that the croaking was actually good, as it kept the Wendigo away. Over time, they got used to the sounds and actually found them quite soothing. Flash forward many years, and Unathana is enrolled in post-secondary education, taking a course on Native American literature. The Wendigo that they're learning about here is described a little differently than they remember their grandmother talking about. Frogs don't really do all that much to protect against such a creature. A damn shame. They then moved to a new place on the edge of town within a stone's throw of a pond just packed with frogs. The noise was once again comforting to them, and they tended to keep their windows open to hear them and enjoy the balmy summer heat. However, the night they recounted this story, things were different. Gone was the heat as well as the sound of frogs. In fact, it was unseasonably cold and the night was quieter than ever. This did not bode well for Unathana, not one bit. Every passing second meant more dread, with nowhere to run or hide. The Wendigo is out there somewhere. Better watch out. Coming in at number 2, we've got Anansi's Goat Man. one of the best known Wendigo Greentext tales. The proliferation of spooky encounter stories on 4chan's paranormal board had a large impact on creepypasta culture in the early 2010s, usually told from a first-person perspective in bullet point form. Well, Anansi's tale starts as a Greentext, maybe to entice more readers to stick around, but soon becomes a more traditionally written story. It chronicles his trip out to Alabama to visit family and the very strange things that happened while in the rural landscape. He and some cousins went out to a little cabin/trailer in the woods and brought some neighbors and other local kids with them. At first, it was just a smell, something like copper or blood that washed over the area. Nobody could explain it, so they tried to ignore it. Then strange figures appeared in the trees making awful noises. Folks were freaked out, so they ditched the fire and went inside, which resulted in plenty of loud bangs at the door. Understandably, lots of people were scared and wanted to leave, but trekking back through the woods late at night with no weapons with all this going on seemed like a bad idea. They decided to stick it out till morning and then leave once whatever rednecks in the woods stopped messing with them. Soon they realized that there were 12 people in the cabin at some point, and now they were just down to 11. Uh-oh. So the next morning, some people left, but Anansi and his buddy Tanner stuck around with a few more folks. The copper smell came and left over and over again, and soon enough they realized that one of the people they were with was acting weird. She ran off slack-jawed into the woods and nobody saw her again. Tanner's cousin showed up later with a gun and claimed to have seen that girl gibbering alone in the woods. He tried to talk to her, but she didn't respond. Weird. On the last night everyone was at the cabin, somebody fired at the figure in the woods, causing it to scream and thrash for hours. During this time, everyone tried to get some sleep in the cabin while Tanner stood guard with the gun. Half asleep, he noticed someone come in from the bathroom and fall asleep on the floor. But that put their head count at higher than he remembered. It's a bad sign. Just to be safe, he continued to pretend to sleep in the guard chair and noticed that the new addition would convulse and thrash around from time to time. The next morning, everyone left except Tanner, who said he'd lock everything up. Checking the bathroom that the extra body came in from, he noticed that the bathroom window was wide open. Whatever this creature was, it was infiltrating their cabin and pretending to be another person the whole time. Horrifying. And finally, at number 1, we've got the Gun Nut Greentext. We'll cap off this list with one more Greentext similar to Anansi's story, but with a different twist. A group of friends from college decided to take a trip out to an uncle's cabin. The stench of blood and copper was just as prevalent here, and over time, the strange event stacked up. The friends heard their own voices off in the woods, calling out for people to come find them. Dead animals were left all over the property, culminating in 2 halves of a deer being thrown at the side of the cabin. Thankfully, these pals were all a bunch of gun nuts with experience making homemade thermite, and when the going got bad, they got to work. Preparing to leave the cabin in the middle of the night, they had different roles for dealing with their Wendigo assailant. Some took point with rifles, while others packed their things. But at the last moment, after one pal went running off into the woods to see what he could find, they noticed something odd. A figure looking like their friend who had just run off was in the back of the cabin, appearing extra disheveled, pretending to pack up with the rest of them. This was their sign to open fire, and toss one of their homebrew thermite grenades after it. Even then, they can't be sure that they actually put an end to whatever shape-shifting creature was stalking them. The cabin ended up as ash though, so they're not planning on visiting anytime soon.
Coming in at number 5, we have the strange tale of Betty and Barney Hill. In 1961, snowbirds Betty and Barney Hill were making their way back home after a vacation in good old Niagara Falls. Now it's important to note, as is usually the case in these kinds of reports, that Betty and Barney Hill were both upstanding citizens, deemed normal by society and their wider community. In other words, they weren't old crazy people. As they made their way south of the border, the couple saw what appeared to be a falling star, but perplexingly, it began to move around the sky, appearing to grow larger in mass. Here's where Barney commits his first horror no-no. Instead of staying on course and driving away on the highway, he decided to drive slowly and follow the light along another road. Eventually, he got so close that the object hovered roughly 100 feet in the distance. Here's where Barney makes his second no-no. He got out of the car and he took a closer look. According to Mr. Hill, it was a strange craft with 8 to 10 humanoid-looking creatures dressed in black uniforms. Horrified, the pair got back in the car and sped away. However, when they frantically returned home, they realized that a trip that should have took them 3 hours mysteriously took them over 7. Did they just get lost on the detour, or did they end up having a little chat with their newfound friends? What do you think? Next up at number 4, the Gundia McKay abduction. This one is just plain weird. 3 different people were involved in this story and they all corroborate the exact same thing. On October the 4th, 2001, at a property in Gundia, Australia, 22-year-old Amy Rylance was abducted by a flying craft as she slept. Her husband Keith and their friend Petra both witnessed this event in action. According to Petra, she saw Amy being pulled out of the window by a strange, bewildering light after being alerted by the sound of shattering glass. The pair were completely perplexed and searched the property for Amy. Amy, but they could find her absolutely nowhere. After calling the police, Keith and Petra were initially suspected of foul play, believing that they'd killed Amy and made up a story just to get away with it. Bizarrely enough though, just an hour later, police received word of a woman who'd been found wandering lost on a remote highway in the city of Mackay, which is a 9-hour drive away. 9 hours. When they found Amy, she claimed that she'd been kept in a strange metal room by a 7-foot tall, calm, ethereal being. Afterwards, she had strange triangular marks on her thigh, which were documented by police, and bizarrely enough, her body hair had grown excessively over a period of few hours. What the hell? What do you guys think? Swinging in at number 3, Robert Taylor. Robert Taylor was a forestry worker who lived in Livingston, Scotland. He was heading down into the woods one day, I think there's a song there, when he turned a corner and just like that, he saw a UFO parked in a field. All of a sudden, Robert said that 2 small, strange spheres were fired out of the object and they made a clattering sound as their spiky surface ploughed through the earth. They attached themselves to Robert, dragging him back towards the vessel. He said that he could smell a strong, sickening odour before he completely lost consciousness. What happened? Well, still no one knows, but when Robert awoke, he'd moved further down the field and his dog was there, barking wildly in panic. When he tried to calm his dog down, he noticed that his voice was gone and he felt incredibly weak with the inability to walk. He ended up crawling all the way back home, where he found his wife in tears. He looked terrible and he'd been gone for over a day. Police began an investigation, but still to this day have no explanation for the bizarre events that transpired. Spooky, eh? And coming in at number 2, the Manhattan Abduction. Well, here we go again. It's a bold enough claim in itself. To claim that you were abducted by a UFO right out of the window of your Manhattan apartment, that takes it to a new level. Strangely enough though, the Manhattan Abduction is one of the most well-documented abduction cases of all time. Originally aliased as Linda Corteil to protect her identity, this New York woman claimed that a beam of light drew her from her apartment window as a small girl, all the way to the top of the building and then into a strange metallic vessel. She was taken through a series of mysterious hallways until she was strapped to a table and subdued by tall humanoid creatures. Kind of sounds like the standard abduction shtick, right? Well, wrong, because this event was actually witnessed by 2 United Nations bodyguards who were stationed with a diplomat in a nearby building. They saw the whole thing, a little girl suspended by a beam of light taken into a strange metallic vessel. Well, even stranger, the 2 bodyguards would later go on to be afflicted by severe psychological maladies, some say as the result of their report. Kind of makes you think who or what was involved, eh? And finally, at number 1, the Allegheny alien abductions. Now, this is my favourite, the absolute classic. A few guys in the deep woods, aliens slip them up in a tractor beam, they wake up in the morning with no recollection, probes, you get the picture. But in actuality, the Allegheny abduction has a little bit more to it. In 1976, 4 friends in their early 20s went camping one weekend in rural Maine. They were Jack, Jim, Chuck, and Charlie, who kind of sound like something straight out of a Stephen King novel. On their second night out in the woods, they noticed a strange, incredibly bright light floating ominously on the horizon. On the third night, as they were night fishing, the light appeared again, so they decided to shine their flashlights right at it, when all of a sudden the light expanded and enveloped all 4 men. Lights out, they remember nothing. They woke up back at their campsite with no recollection of the events that had just transpired between them being in their boat and not being in their boat. The fire, which had been roaring just minutes before, burned down to nothing but embers. Well, after this strange occurrence, the men started to have similar nightmares of humanoid beings with long necks and large heads with large metallic eyes and insect-like fingers. They began drawing what they saw in their dreams, and after a while they connected the dots and realized they were having the exact same shared nightmare, remnants of consciousness left over from their reported abduction. So coherent was their shared story that experts began analysing the group, and although the results are undocumented, the 4 men were deemed mentally stable and they all passed lie detector tests about the event. Makes you wonder whether a clear, corroborated story is evidence enough for proof of the paranormal.
Coming in at number 5, we've got an ancient appearance. Most folks seem to think that tales of Nessie started showing up at the turn of the 20th century, with personal photography being more common than ever before, and cameras ending up in the hands of more individuals. It was possible to snap a few shots of the aquatic entity. Most of these pictures have been debunked at this point, but we'll get to that later. The thing is though, accounts of the Loch Ness monster go way back. Like seriously far back through history. Back before photography or the printing press or even common writing. That's right, people were discussing the Loch Ness Monster back in the age of cave drawings and stone carvings. Apparently folks had found depictions of a strange, flipper, dinosaur-like creature among the carvings by the Pict, an ancient people thought to have lived in what's now eastern and northeastern Scotland. The Picts were first noticed in 297 AD, which puts the origin of this legend way earlier than people usually assume. Then a few hundred years later we have the first written account of Nessie. A monster that bit swimmers in the water was mentioned in St. Columba's biography. Don't worry though, Columba told it to go back and Nessie listened. What a lovely Loch Ness monster, right? After being banished by St. Columba, Nessie only made occasional appearances over the years. This only added to the legendary status of the beast, however, as many people would discuss it over the years. Who would have thought that scarcity would make something more interesting and valuable to people? Limited edition Loch Ness monster signings signed me and the rest of the internet up. Wild how a creature first dreamed up so many years ago can have such a vice grip on the popular conscience. Coming in number 4, we've got the surgeon's photo. This is where things get really wild concerning the Loch Ness monster, and by wild I mean mostly popular. Every story has a big turning point, and this is probably it for Nessie. If we relied strictly on Pictish stories of an ancient aquatic beast, I doubt it would be the force it is today. So instead we look at a photograph snapped by a surgeon, thus the surgeon's photo. In the 1930s, a new road was finished right by the famous Loch Ness, which provided a new unobstructed view of the body of water. Many people journeyed out to bask in the splendor of such a sight, and in doing so opened the proverbial floodgates to new experiences. In 1933 someone spotted an enormous beast in the water and the legend was reborn. Confirmation is difficult when it comes to stuff like this, so different stories began to fly around. We're talking about hypothetical hippopotamus sightings here, folks. In fact, a big game hunter was hired to figure out just what was going on. He discovered some large footprints along the shore that seemed to belong to a powerful soft-footed animal. This was, like most information regarding Nessie, proven to be a hoax though. However, what really galvanized the tale was the photograph mentioned in the subtitle. In 1934, Robert Kenneth Wilson managed to produce a photograph seemingly depicting the head and neck of Nessie popping out of the water. When the Daily Mail printed the picture, popularity exploded. People wanted to see this with their own two eyes and flocked to Loch Ness to see if they could catch a glimpse. Some even speculated that this was a plesiosaur, long believed to have gone extinct. What a time to be alive, am I right? Well, this photo has undergone intense scrutiny as well, inspiring plenty of skeptics to do their best debunking it. However, no matter how many people point out potential forgeries in the photo, its impact remains unchanged. This photograph cemented Nessie as a bona fide urban legend and creature of renown, and for years after it was taken, it would enthrall creature enthusiasts and whimsical minds alike. Coming in number 3, In Search Of. If you search, you can find. It's a pretty solid motto, don't you think? And with that in mind, take a look at what these guys found while investigating Loch Ness. It's pretty wild to think that a modern camera crew can just decide to head out on the water and find something, but hey, you can't really tell what they found exactly, but any sort of unexplainable occurrence in Loch Ness will be chalked up to some enormous long-necked beast. See, the crew went out with the intent to sight the beautiful monster and did everything in their power to catch that glimpse. First, something pinged on their radar, alerting them to a huge moving presence beneath the surface. This was the diving crew's signal to hop into the water and give it a look, which, by the way, is a bonkers thing to do. Imagine your boss claiming that there was a huge monster in the water and then telling you to hop in. Hilarious. The divers brought with them an underwater camera rig, but soon the light was pretty dim. Suddenly something moved in the water nearby, knocking the camera off its axis and kicking up all sorts of muck and mire. No clear shots ended up in the footage, but the fact that something like that happened is fascinating. So what do you think? Was it Nessie? Something else, perhaps? Adding to the legend of Loch Ness for sure. Coming in number 2, we've got the Beast of Loch Ness. Over the years, many folks have claimed to see the legendary creature. In fact, documentarians have done their best to immortalize a lot of the accounts. At one point, a Nova film called The Beast of Loch Ness was created, jam-packed with first-hand tales of Nessie. Ian Cameron, a retired superintendent of the Northern Police Force, was out fishing with a friend when he saw the monster. About 200 yards from where he was standing, something huge and whale-like seemed to breach the surface. He looked to his friend, who was equally confused and enthralled. Since then, they've claimed that the sighting was real, although they know they can't convince anyone without them seeing it with their own two eyes. Then there's Val Moffat, who was driving along the edge of the lake on her way home. Out of the corner of her eye, she spotted something moving through the water, kinda brown and sludgy. It kept surfacing and then descending back under the water, and as she kept driving, she kept seeing it happen. She claims to have almost driven right off the road, but thankfully she didn't. Ronald McIntosh, a lifelong Loch Ness resident, claims to have seen the creature pull off a wicked jump. He was in the backseat of his family's car on the way to town when he saw something that made him yell, "Stop the car!" They all looked towards the lake and saw something as big as a bus fly out of the water and then come crashing down with a splash. Even years later, they haven't come up with a solid explanation as to what it might have been, other than Nessie. And finally at number 1, we've got Steve Chalice. Now you know I've got to include at least one super recent sighting on this list just to keep everyone on their toes. This happened in 2020. Steve Chalice was taking pictures while on vacation and seemed to have picked up evidence of a massive creature moving through the water at Loch Ness. You can see ripples and waves and possibly the outline of a huge beast. The internet was abuzz with all sorts of crazy theories, from somebody pulling off a wicked hoax to the actual monster being around. However, Chalice himself doesn't seem too convinced that he actually snapped a pic of the monster, so who knows? We live in a mysterious world, why not add some additional mystery? Coming in at number 5, we've got the Stalker Challenge. Right on, you might hear that name and think it's one thing, but it's actually probably not the first conclusion your mind lands upon. The Stalker Challenge isn't about following someone around or testing a pal's skills at going unnoticed in the dark. It's actually a reference to a popular PC game called Stalker, where players explore an alternate reality Chernobyl exclusion zone. A lot of folks praise it for its lonesome and isolated atmosphere and the more realistic gunplay. Plenty of online military enthusiasts, survivalists, and Tarkovsky fans enjoy the game, so when we say that this Wendigo sighting was a result of the Stalker Challenge, we can probably assume the writer was a fan of Stalker and wanted to experience living life solo in the wastelands for a while. During this temporary hermitage, he worked his way into the middle of nowhere with nothing but some vodka, guns, and a harmonica. Like a true survivalist, he hunted some small game, made a meal of it, and explored the surrounding area. Snacking on the rabbit he'd hunted, he heard some rustling coming from the bushes, but didn't think anything of it. The next day, he was startled awake by some screaming. Weird, especially considering how far he was from civilization. Grabbing his rifle, he went off in the direction of the scream. It didn't seem to come from one singular location, and eventually the writer got lost. After a long day wandering around, he found his way back to the camp he'd set up, but now somebody else was there. There was a humanoid form in tattered clothes staring down at his fire pit, unmoving. Worried that this person might be injured, the writer called out to him. No response. After a few minutes of standing there staring at him, he again asked if he was alright. The humanoid figure turned to him and said, "I wouldn't worry about it." This set off alarm bells for the writer, who began to back away. At that point, the humanoid mentioned that he could go for another meal right now, prompting the writer to book it out of there. Hearing the humanoid running behind him, he turned around and shot blindly, apparently finding his mark. The creature screamed, the same scream from earlier, and seemingly disappeared. The writer eventually made it to the road and encountered a car. He didn't look back. Coming in at number 4, we've got the Nebraskan Wendigo. If you weren't already wary of traveling alone in Nebraska, now you've got a whole new reason. That's right, a new spooky story of someone's close encounter with a third kind. Maybe not an alien, but hey. This tale comes from a guy who was a farmhand when he was younger. One night, the farmer he worked for asked if he could figure out who was trampling all the corn stalks at night. Excited to take on guard duty, the farmhand stayed up to see if he could catch the culprit. Armed with the farmer's shotgun and the advice not to shoot unless absolutely necessary, he hung out in a lawn chair and walked around the field a few times. Eventually, he heard rustling from within the cornfield, followed by what sounded like giggling children. This, of course, was the most unsettling moment of the farmhand's entire life. Not wanting to hurt kids, but also not wanting to get children of the corned, he brandished his gun and told them to leave unless they were looking for trouble. The giggling stopped and the rest of the night went smoothly. However, the next morning the farmer discovered something a little more disturbing than trampled corn. His cow, which had been left in the barn, was totally exsanguinated. All the blood in this animal was removed somehow and didn't leave any on the floors. The farmer called the cops and somehow managed to land on the explanation that it was some idiot kids, but the farmhand didn't quite buy that. However, the following night both the farmer and the farmhand stayed up to see if they could find anyone. The farmhand, sitting in his chair again, heard the giggling once more. This time he asked whoever it was to reveal himself, prompting a gigantic humanoid creature with antlers to shuffle out of the field. Bad call, to be honest. The farmhand shot at the beast and began to run away. During his flight, he was tripped by a gopher hole and fell to the ground hard. Suddenly it was morning and the farmhand was back inside the house, surrounded by the farmer's family. The farmer had told the cops that he was attacked by some random guy, but he chased him off. However, afterwards, the farmer took the farmhand aside and told him that he saw the beast too. It was on all fours after the boy tripped, and it took 6 shots from his rifle to scare it off. From then on, they didn't go out after dusk, and they kept guns on them at all times around the farm. Coming in at number 3, we've got a Nevadan Wendigo. Not Nebraska, Nevada. This is a different tale, although curiously enough, the protagonist of this story is the same age as the protagonist of our farmhand extravaganza. Funny how that works. While exploring some abandoned mine shafts, great idea I know, this lad felt as if he was being watched. Moving right along, he eventually encountered some old abandoned cabins. After looking through, he found a well, and this well stunk to high heaven, a strange, acrid, coppery smell, sort of a mix between fresh blood, rotten meat, and pennies. Not wanting to be around it anymore, he decided to head back towards the mine shafts. However, when he did, he saw something crouching inside of one. At first, he thought it was a mountain lion, as he'd seen them around these parts before, but then he realized how big the thing crouching in the shaft was. The openings were usually 8 to 10 feet tall, and this thing couldn't stand up straight inside of it. It moved towards the opening, revealing a bunch of matted brownish fur, and then it screamed. The kind of scream that haunts your dreams until the end of your life. Our explorer pal felt his blood go cold and immediately shot at this creature with his rifle. A few rounds to the torso did nothing to stop it, however, and it continued to scream. Time to run. He scrambled away, jumping over fallen trees and occasionally turning back to fire quick pot shots and check if it was close. Eventually he made it back to his truck and hightailed it out of there, averaging 60 miles per hour. He drove without stopping until he got home where his dad was waiting. His dad asked him how the trip went and where he ended up, noticing that his son was quite shaken. When our mineshaft exploring storyteller explained to his dad where he'd been, his dad appeared concerned and told him to never go back to that location. They didn't talk about it again. Coming in at number 2, we've got the Allegheny Forest Encounter. As I find more and more of these stories, I realize how absolutely terrifying the forest can be. Did I realize this as a kid when I went camping, or when I decided to go way off track while visiting remote cottages? Probably not, but I'm still here, right? This story comes from a hunter and his seasoned outdoorsman buddy. They'd gone fishing in the woods and made sure to prepare adequately. Black bears around that area, so they had their guns with them. After encountering a mangled deer corpse, they were a little unsettled. However, they chalked it up to a bear or maybe some coyotes and kept moving. A little while later, something set off the buddy's spidey senses and he asked for his gun. Moving to the middle of the creek, they saw a bear running through the woods full tilt. It was followed pretty closely by a deer headed in the same direction. But why would a deer be chasing a bear? Well, it wouldn't. Something was chasing both of these creatures, something huge. From afar it looked like a massive deer with superimposing antlers, but as it ran, it noticed the two hunters and moved towards them. When it got up close, they realized that it had a huge maw full of teeth that could only be described as belonging to a carnivore. That was all the warning they needed. Shooting at the beast while running away, they made sure to put as much distance between them and it as possible. Eventually they made it to a plateau where nothing seemed to be wrong. Reloading their weapons and looking around for any sign of trouble, they realized they were in the clear. Miles from their base camp, they hiked all the way back on high alert but never encountered the creature again. Even now, they have no idea what the hell they ran into. And at number 1, we've got another farm experience. This one doesn't stem from working on a farm though, it stems from living on one. When the writer was about 13, he and some friends lived in a rural area and would often get together to goof around in the woods. Meeting at one friend's farm, they chased each other around with sticks for a little while. However, our narrator ran off and stumbled upon a dead deer with some limbs missing. This led to the discovery of a bunch of dismembered animal parts strewn about the entrance to the woods. At that point, most of the friends went back to the farmhouse, while our fearless storyteller and a couple more pals went to investigate. This expedition resulted in the discovery of a dead cow with missing ribs, broken legs, and a head picked clean of soft tissue. Yuck. That was it for the night and everyone got home safe. About a week later though, while hanging out near his house, the storyteller heard what he thought was his dog. Thinking it would rush out of the bush and beg for a treat, he wandered in the direction the noise was coming from, but what came out of the bush was not his dog. It was a shambling abomination, walking around like a newborn doe, covered in viscera with teeth as sharp as knives. Needless to say, he ran right inside. That night, while gripping a baseball bat in bed, he heard an awful scratching upon the wall outside his room. As this happened, his dog started freaking out, barking at the back door. Our storyteller rushed downstairs and grabbed the dog, double checking that his door was locked, and he stayed up all night listening for more. The noises eventually subsided and dawn broke. In the morning light, he peeked outside the door and saw an assortment of pig's feet strewn about the porch. Yikes.